Welcome back to another episode of the Resinator's Conquest podcast. This episode, we're going to talk about the charge action as it relates to First Blood. The First Blood rules can be found on Para-Bellum's website. The rules start explaining about the charge action on page 34. Let's get into some examples. So the first rule with charging is you can't come into reinforcements and charge. To make a charge in First Blood, what you're going to do is measure the distance between your leader and the closest enemy model. And in this case, we're going to measure 7 inches. That'd be my charging distance. So then I'd roll a die. I'll grab a dice. So then I'd roll a die, add it to the moving characteristic, which is 5. And in this case, I would have failed. Now, if the charge fails, then you're going to lose that action. Now, if you have a second action, you can go ahead and take that second action, but you got to realize that you've already attempted and failed a charge on your first action, so you cannot do a charge on your second action. Remember, marching is the only action that you could do twice in a round. So if you fail the charge, like in this case, you'd have to do a different action, like marching or doing something else. In this case, let's re-roll and say we end up getting a 3. So we're going to add that to their march characteristic, which would be 5 for the Steel Legion here, which would be a total of 8, and they'd be able to march in. So then we're going to go ahead and show the movement and how you do that. You're going to start with your leader, just like we made a measurement with our leader, and we're going to move him 8 inches close to the closest regiment, the closest models here. So the way we're going to do it is we're going to go straight into him, so we're going to go like this and march him in right there. And then everyone else can move 8 inches in close to the enemy. Let's see if you can get it close to that one. Nope. You won't get close enough to the other one, so we're going to put him close here. And then this guy, let's see. I think he can get close enough. So that puts him right there. Let's move this last guy, and then we'll see if he's close enough to be engaged. So this guy is not going to be engaged because he's outside the 1 inch. But let's measure here. Well, let's start at the 2, just so you can see. So he is actually, yes, within 1 inch of this Mori. So he's actually engaged. This Steel Legion is engaged, and this Steel Legion is engaged. However, this one, he's definitely not within. He's like almost inch and a half away from the Mori, so he would not be engaged. All right, so now let's do a different scenario. So here's another scenario we have that could happen in First Blood. You have the Steel Legion that want to charge, and they're going to charge the Mori. So if they roll a 3 on their dice for their march distance, and as you can see here, they are 7 inches away from the Mori. So that would definitely make it a successful charge. So he would move in close and attack here. This Steel Legion would move up his 8 inches. Then this guy would move up his 8 inches. But now there is nowhere for this last Steel Legion to actually get into combat here, into engagement range. So what you can also do is, as long as you're within the 5 inches of your leader, you can go a different direction and engage a different enemy. And now he's engaged with the Praetorian Guard. So that would be a successful charge. And now the Steel Legion are engaged with 2 different regiments, both the Mori and the Praetorian Guard. And always remember that after a successful charge, the charging regiment gets inspired for the rest of that round. So if they, on their next action, if that was their first action, a charge action, on their second action when they're doing a clash, they'll be inspired. And remember, when you successfully charge with certain units, like these household knights from the 100 Kingdoms, that when they successfully charge, they will get part of that charge action is to make sure that they get their impact attacks, which would be their attacks halved, rounded up. One note about the impact attacks, they are not inspired because technically the impact attacks happen at the end of the charge. So it's still part of the charge action, it's not part of the clash action that would come second. So just always remember that. But they would definitely get their impact attacks, and make sure to take those before you move on to the second action, or if that was their, if the charge was their second action, then, before they move on to deactivating. Now let's move on to a little bit of advice and experience that I've had with First Blood and charging. First off, I was charging incorrectly when I first started playing First Blood. I missed one key important factor in charging that I just wasn't using for a little while, and that was measuring from the actual leaders into the enemy regiment that you would like to charge. I was just doing it from the closest, enemy or friendly model to the closest enemy model, and that's not the way that it actually charges working in First Blood. So just be aware that it's from the leader or one of the leaders that you want to charge from, and that's going to be the distance that you're charging, or your charge distance is calculated from. When it comes to First Blood and charging, it's a little bit more straightforward than First Blood, so there's not a lot of advice that I can give. Because you don't really have to maneuver. It's more of like you can get into engagement pretty easily. Some things to remember is that if you fail a charge in First Blood, remember that doesn't mean that you lost your second action. So if you took a charge action on your the first of your two actions and it failed, you still have a second action, unlike Last Argument of Kings. Now, you don't move forward like in Last Argument of Kings. Your regiment stays exactly where it is. And with your second action, you can't then try to perform another charge because you've already attempted a charge and failed. So you can't attempt two different charges. Remember that the only action that you could do twice in a round is marching. And remember that you can't charge if the regiment just came in from reinforcements. Another thing is to remember, when calculating the number of impact attacks, remember to round up, not down. And also remember that in First Blood, line of sight is actually blocked by melee, and you cannot shoot into melee. So once you've engaged in Last Argument, you can no longer attack them. So this is a kind of a really important thing to pay attention to, unlike Last Argument of Kings. In Last Argument of Kings, if you are engaged with an enemy regiment, you could still volley into that enemy regiment, as long as you have line of sight of it. Now, in First Blood, that's not the case. You cannot shoot volleys into engaged enemy regiments. So that's one way to actually kind of protect your regiments. If you have a strong regiment, like I think in one of my examples I had the Steel Legion, which is a pretty strong regiment, and I might want to protect them. So I want to get them into engagement as quickly as possible, so that kind of protects them from being volleyed from other units and being kind of whittled down until they're really weak, and then they can't really do anything at that point. I like to make sure that my important units are engaged as quickly as possible and that they're kind of protected from volleys. That's about it. Next episode, we're going to move on to volley action. Okay, the first rule of Fight Club is that you can't talk about Fight Club.